Hello, and welcome to MDIC's annual public forum. During today's session, representatives from Roche Diagnostics, Abbott, Mayo Clinic, and FDA will come together to discuss how real-world evidence can advance diagnostics in the COVID-19 era. Please make sure to join in the conversation on Twitter by following @MDIC Annual Forum and using the hashtag MDICAPF 2020. Now, please welcome session moderator Danelle Miller, Vice President, Global Regulatory Policy and Intelligence at Roche Diagnostics.
Welcome. We have a wonderful panel here today to talk about real-world evidence with respect to COVID-19. And I'd like each of the panel members first to introduce themselves. So let's start with Tyler O'Neill.
My name is Tyler O'Neill. I'm a clinical science leader within the acute care program at Roche Diagnostics, and I was formerly a principal scientist of real-world evidence, also within Roche Diagnostics.
Ed.
Hello, my name is Ed Hireman, and I am with Abbott Laboratories, but I'm also the Chief Technology Officer for the IICC, which is the IVD Industry Connectivity Consortium. So we've been in existence for over 10 years and have worked within the industry to help promote things such as semantic interoperability, which we think is an important part of the topic today.
Terrific. Thank you, Ed. Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy Rubinstein. I joined FDA in the fall. I'm a medical geneticist and a molecular geneticist. I've worked in hereditary cancer for many years, went to NIH for several years to start databases, including ClinVar, and spent the past few years working in real-world data, real-world evidence. I helped to develop the American Society of Clinical Oncology's M-Code, which is a set of common data elements for oncology, and looking forward to this webinar.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Wendy. Bill.
Yeah, hi, my name is Bill Maurice. I am the Chair of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology at Mayo Clinic and also the President of Mayo Clinic Laboratories. I'm a hematopathologist by training and it really am responsible now for operations and clinical practice at our laboratories here in the Midwest and which have to serve hospitals across the globe and across the country. So we've been very interested in the use of real-world data for both driving operations and utilization, as well as making meaningful observations from the data itself. And so excited to talk about how we're going to exercise those capabilities as an end user in the setting of COVID-19.
Thanks, Bill. The format today is I will ask questions of our panelists, and they can ask questions of each other. This will be a great conversation about real-world evidence generally. So let's go ahead and kick this off with my first question, which is to Wendy Rubinstein. Wendy, we've been in the COVID-19 pandemic for about 4 months now, and we have a multitude of tests available on the market. We understand that FDA and others are engaged in efforts right now to collect and analyze real-world data to see how these tests are performing, the tests that detect SARS-CoV-2 as well as the tests that look for antibodies. Can you describe these efforts for us, and what additional efforts would FDA like to see?
Thank you, Danelle. So I think it's worth starting off here by saying that we're all in a situation where the tests that are now in use have been reviewed using emergency use authorization level of data. And that's to serve getting the technology into use as quickly as possible. And that's where the real-world evidence, real-world data becomes so important. So there are many efforts going on. One that I think I want to put up front, probably because I'm most familiar with it, is the SHIELD project. What I've found, and maybe the way I think about data, is it's a matter of making the connections, and it's not as if this data doesn't exist. We have tons of data. The problem, we're not data poor. We have data that is not in a format that's usable. We have data that doesn't talk to other data. And so the SHIELD project is one effort to make data interoperable. And that means being precise about the actual test that was performed, not just that a COVID diagnostic test was performed, but what the manufacturer was, and getting down to the code level, and doing that in terms of the test that was ordered and the results. Fortunately, COVID data, I would say, are not that complicated. You know, you want to understand some basics about the test and some basics about the results, but it's not as if we're trying to categorize an entire next generation sequencing pipeline and all of its nuances. So I'll stop with that.
Ed, I hope you don't mind following up. Wendy mentioned interoperability. Can you tell us a little bit more about interoperability and the impact that it has on the availability and access to data, particularly on in vitro diagnostics?
Sure. Yeah. So you know, interoperability is an important part of, you know, semantic and IVD testing. Really, because, you know, it's as Wendy highlighted, we have data, and it's really just a matter of collecting the data, making sure it's consistent, it's accurate, but also that it's been collected in a way that makes it easily understood. And it's by having that easily understood data that really you collect at the very beginning. Because in most cases, this data is being collected by some type of instrumentation, you know, some activities in the laboratory. So you want to make sure that you've got it, you know, right then and there, you've collected what's needed, and then you've collected it in a manner that allows it to be distributed, you know, to these other systems, so that these real-world evidence, you know, collected as real-world data, so that these real-world evidence activities can take place. So it's really a matter of making sure at the very beginning, when that test is performed, when that result is generated, you've got the information right then and there. You've done whatever it needs to be so that it can be collected and really compared against all of the other data that's now been collected as well.
Terrific. Bill, Mayo has invested quite a bit, it looks like recently from the articles that I've read, in digital health and in access to data. Can you talk a little bit about what Mayo's doing to make sure that you can get that access to the data and what you're doing with it?
Well, you know, so first of all, I mean, it's great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity. And Mayo Clinic, our practice is an integrated practice. And that's really been our history. And ironically, as we had this conversation, one of the early innovations of Mayo was the single medical record by Henry Plummer, which was handwritten data, but all in one spot and accessible to anyone who was seeing the patient. And I think that really reflects what our aspirations for a digital environment as well, is as we move into digital health, the end user has access to all the data that they need without having to go through different systems and through, you know, basically requiring the end user to understand how the data is actually architected and structured to answer their questions. So our aspirations and investments have been very much in bringing data into unified platforms so we can move seamlessly between different data elements or data sets, and also them finding ways to present that to an end user that they don't have to be a data expert to answer or query the data to get the answers that they want or need.
Terrific. Tyler, I know that there's a lot of interest among IVD manufacturers in getting access to the data about their tests so that they, for example, can take an emergency use authorization test to full marketing status. So they would use the data for submission for a 510K or de novo. Can you tell us a little bit about what types of data quality issues that manufacturers might need to consider?
Thanks, Danelle. So in many instances, method sheets in the emergency setting are self-declared and developed with minimal inputs to rapidly bring a device to market through an EUA. And this is, of course, followed up by post-marketing commitments to ensure the safety and effectiveness of the product according to the intended use, which represents a considerable value proposition of real-world data in and of itself. We could, however, presuppose that a manufacturer could come to a regulator with a plan to fulfill post-marketing commitments, which would include a plan to evaluate the diagnostic performance in real-world practice, for example. And potentially this could include elements that are data elements that are needed to meet that claim, very similar to what we see in data from clinical trials. In all cases, though, I think a well-defined and clear guidance on what is required or necessary to consider regarding issues of data quality of the database or data itself, in addition to the individual variables that will be included, is certainly necessary from a regulatory framework perspective. And I think that there's excellent thinking going on with the FDA on this particular topic, and it's certainly maturing at a good pace. But how we can actually expedite this to really support regulatory assessment while ensuring that products on market are extended from their EUA and doing what they're supposed to be doing for the patients in the settings that they're intended for is certainly necessary. And data quality are really the characteristics that influence both the reliability and the relevance of such data capture, using clear objectional definitions, standardized outcome measures, appropriate data checks, appropriate measurement and capture of confounders, and most important for IVDs, as was mentioned earlier, around the product of interest that is sufficiently identified in the data source itself. And so data quality is really the foundation upon which valid real-world data studies and scientific inference can be made for regulatory decision-making for not only for coronavirus, but also for other EUA settings. And having objective quality criteria would be an important contribution of the regulator, and working with industry and academia in supporting the use of such data, not only for SARS-CoV-2 solutions, but will have lasting and hopefully positive effects on how we bring products to market in the future.
Great. Wendy, I'm hearing the interest that the IVD manufacturers have in bringing currently EUA authorized products to the FDA for full marketing status. What would the agency be looking for in real world evidence to make sure that it met the valid scientific evidence?
Well, I think that's one of the questions everybody's really asking. And I think I want to frame this by saying that there's actually not a fundamental difference in the type of evidence that FDA would like to see with respect to RWD and other types of applications, because we work within the regulations and statutes and follow what they say. And so the definition of valid scientific evidence is the same regardless of whether it's RWD or not. In fact, any type of scientific evidence can be submitted. What makes it acceptable or valid is that it comes from well-controlled investigations, partially controlled studies. You can even use reports of human experience. Where it becomes more difficult in the RWD space is that you're not controlling in the traditional way. You're not selecting at the outset, usually, a comparative arm. But you are doing the same thing within the context of data that's usually retrospectively reviewed. And there are methods for making sure that a controlled population is matched appropriately, taking into account if you need to use methods like propensity score matching, or also that you're taking into account the missingness that is usually inherent in the data, and then applying methods to make sure that your analytic approach is valid, given that some of the data are likely to be missing.
Bill, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Having heard sort of what Wendy said with respect to what IVD manufacturers need to have and some of the data quality challenges that Tyler has enumerated and Ed has talked about interoperability, how could an IVD manufacturer work with Mayo to get that type of data?
Well, I was thinking from the opposite, how would Mayo work with some of the IVD manufacturers to understand how they're ensuring quality, and what are some of the data elements that will make it trackable and traceable into our environment. I think from our perspective, the conclusions that we want to help make with the FDA are going to require both longitudinal integration of data as well as depth of data at a single instance. So you have to really go in both directions, both lengthwise as well as single instance. And so for us, having understanding that completeness that Wendy speaks to is really important. I think for when you open talking about either the effectiveness in terms of the sensitivity of some of the molecular methods or the serologic testing, you know, understanding that how we're going to link the specific tests to other data in the health record and to outcomes to kind of understand how those tests are performing becomes important. So then with the IVD manufacturers, I think it really becomes important to understand what are their quality standards, what are elements that will be missing from, as we look into their data sets, there will be things and missing elements from the conclusions they would want to draw as they look into the electronic health record. Conversely, if we want to do comparative analysis from an operational perspective on the performance of different assays, we're going to need those same data elements to be present from a number of different manufacturers so we can go back and trace and create completeness of observations. So those are the things that come to mind as I hear the conversation.
Great. Tyler and Ed as well. How would you create a clinical study design with real world evidence to get to this type of data?
Yeah, so to echo my earlier comments about data quality, I think that first and foremost, research quality is also of paramount importance. And this specifically refers to like the rigor of study design, operation, analysis of the study intended to develop real world evidence, certainly for the cases for regulatory decision making. At a minimum, studies should develop an a priori formal protocol, even though it's observational in nature, along with an analysis plan that clearly articulates the study dependencies, the outcomes and approach that's going to be taken, very similar to what we see documented in clinical trials. It's also important that such a plan considers relevant bias and documents how they will be addressed. And there are many other details that should be accounted for, such as addressing async data, sufficient sample size, follow-up time, and so on, which really can speak to how we can interpret the evidence. And so just like data quality, again, research quality with adequate documentation for reproducibility will be critical for evidence for EUAs in SARS-CoV-2, not only now, but certainly for future use cases of real-world data. So we don't want to get too specific around what could be used as a study design, but rather stay at a high level around considerations when thinking about approaching evidence generation using real-world data.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. Ed?
Yeah, and so really now kind of focusing on the data itself, because that's the critical foundation for all this. And as an industry, as Wendy has highlighted, we've come together under the SHIELD initiative. And I think those same discussions we've had as to understanding semantic interoperability, what's the right data to collect, what vocabularies, what common vocabularies do we want to use so that everyone easily understands this was the test performed. And for many manufacturers, you know, they have different configurations in laboratory on how the test is performed. What specimen was used, that's going to be important. What type of result was being collected? Was it a qualitative or was it a quantitative in what you're doing, maybe mass concentration, substance concentration? And so those are all very important elements of any of these, you know, real world data, real world evidence activities. And that's why I think that the work we've done under the SHIELD across the industry, where it's both government, it's the industry, it's healthcare providers, of taking a step back and going, you know, what really needs to be collected from these tests? What need to be collected from the instruments? How can we make sure this information is transmitted in a consistent, complete manner? Because those same mechanisms can be used for something like the clinical studies, along with other things where we're doing public health initiatives, et cetera, with COVID-19 right now. And so, you know, the work we've done, you know, the work that has taken place, the work that continues, to me, is all sets up that foundation for the right data is being collected, and it's data in a manner that can be compared, analyzed, you know, not only within a single instrument, but maybe even across instrument as you might be doing studies with peers.
And Ed, I'm going to follow up with what you said there, especially your reference to common terminology. How close are we to common terminology when it comes to identification of in vitro diagnostics?
You know, well, we're getting very close. There's been a lot of effort that's been put forth to help us, standardize and establish that common vocabulary. And as you mentioned, the test identification was really the first part of it that we've been tackling. And that's because in general, most manufacturers are going to identify their test in a manner that are appropriate for them, for their environment, their instrument. But what you really need though is that once that test makes its way into other systems, there's got to be a consistent way to know this is a glucose and a glucose ran on this specimen type, whether it came from maybe an Abbott instrument, a Roche instrument, et cetera. So a lot of effort has been put forth, not only by working on these interfaces that our instruments have so that when they're transmitting information to other systems in the laboratory, it's done in a consistent manner and using common vocabularies. But there's also been another initiative called LIVID, which is linked to IVD, which one of the main foundations at the moment for establishing LOINC as the common vocabulary for test identification. And it's addressing not only up and coming instruments and being able to potentially do that through their interfacing, but the legacy instruments in which the interfacing can't necessarily be updated. But we've standardized on a format to provide mapping tables so manufacturers can provide that information, and it's very easy then for the LIS systems and other applications in the laboratory to take the information from the instrument, apply the mapping, and then now you have it in a consistent vocabulary that can be delivered to further systems upstream.
Great. One more question, follow up to you, Ed, is, with emergency use authorizations, they're not required to carry the unique device identifier. So does that complicate the ability to identify a specific IVD, particularly in an emergency situation? Or is there another number out there that will allow that level of detection or identification?
Yeah, and that certainly is a challenge as you get into really all of a sudden encountering a situation like this where you don't have information that you had for those tests that were approved through the normal channels, and we're taking a good long look at that. And yes, there are other things that can be used. So even if you don't have a unique device identifier, it's all kind of based on the foundation of, well, you know who the manufacturer is, the model or the kind of device that was used in the testing, the test kit and what the test kit is. All of those have other identifiers that at least at a minimum, you can collect those and use those as part of your identifying information. And then ideally, in the future, as these, the tests and other things, make their way through the appropriate channels, they will be, assigned unique device identifiers, and those can now be folded into the data. But it should still be very easy and straightforward to take the data that's being collected today and still align it with maybe the data we'll collect in the future.
Okay, great. Shift gears just a little bit. I'd like to talk a little bit about digital diagnostics and clinical decision support, other aspects, and how real-world data can support SARS-CoV-2 related digital diagnostics as well as software as a medical device.
Thanks, Danelle. From my perspective, working in digital diagnostics, this is an absolutely critical pillar of diagnosis, management, monitoring, and certainly prevention of SARS-CoV-2, both at the patient and the population level. And we really have an unprecedented opportunity to leverage digital solutions, whether it be through the core practice of medicine within EHR or through digital solutions that are actually supporting appropriate resource utilization, testing and testing interpretation, patient management, all the way through to patient-facing applications like contact tracing and how to conduct him or herself if in contact with a known positive patient. The ability to collect all this information in almost real time, very much to Bill's earlier point about large volumes of data being generated, should certainly be taken advantage of. And I think that if I think about it within two facets, from data input around the development of algorithms to support test interpretation, the opportunity for building clinical decision-making applications, again, resource utilization, forecasting, population health management, is all where we can really see value in terms of managing this pandemic, and certainly future infectious disease and even metabolic non-infectious diseases in the healthcare setting. Well, at the same time, if we think about data outputs, this has incredible value through the use of digital solutions for regulatory data capture for coronavirus, and certainly for future models of how we would achieve the post-marketing commitments for claim expansion, or for claim expansion, gaining further insights around clinical utility of products in a rather heterogeneous patient population and clinical setting. So I really encourage manufacturers to think about how can you leverage the tools you have available to you today to drive innovation and access of core assays through digital solutions, and provide into the marketplace support software and other tools that can really broaden the value base of the diagnostics that you're bringing to the clinical market.
Thank you, Tyler. I'd like to ask a similar question to Bill to get a different perspective from Mayo's institutional perspective. Is clearly you're doing a lot of innovation and using real-world data in a lot of different ways. How are you using it to innovate in the digital healthcare space?
We've been doing a lot, actually pre-COVID, in this space to really look at real-world utilization of testing, and comparing that to outcomes to guide clinical decision support on both on the ordering of tests, and as well as the actions taken with that ordering. So as an example, we have a lot of tests that we know are really dramatically overutilized. A good example is hemoglobin A1C. That's all very much retrospective data that's collected. So what we put in place were systems where we could actually collect real-time ordering patterns for hemoglobin A1C, also look at outcomes for patients in terms of their need for diabetic care, and start to model the best ways to use the test to support the diagnosis. And that's pretty clear we're going to have to do the same thing now with COVID. There's a lot of questions right now around the value of testing, whether it's repeat testing in the hospital setting, or the value of serologic testing and demonstrating protection from repeat infection. Those are questions that really need to be answered. In my mind, as Tyler was speaking, is understanding is a need for repeat testing to manage patients that have potential COVID complications like thrombosis and thromboembolism. Is that tied to the analytic itself or to the clinical scenario? Unless we have good data that allows us to go back and actually go out to the assay level and understand what assay was performed on what specimen, it becomes difficult for us to know what is the best practice, because we can't take out the covariate of assay performance itself. So that's really where we really want to start thinking about how we would collect evidence on the diagnostics to understand. And likewise, if you have if the positive predictive value of a serologic test is low, it becomes difficult to then use the real-world evidence to draw conclusions around protective immunity and reinfection. So again, that goes all the way back to analytical performance of the assay itself. So that's really where our thinking is right now with COVID-19 and the data that we want to collect, is that it can continue to drive meaningful observations about how to use the testing. But to do that, we have to actually have data that tracks back to the actual test used, and as well as the specimen and other operational elements around the test.
So Wendy, I'd like to pull you back into the conversation. What additional efforts would the FDA like to see with respect to real-world data related to COVID-19? And let's just assume money and time are not an object.
Well, I think that's an entree to talk about some ongoing efforts. One is the Reagan-Udall Evidence Accelerator. And another is additional work that the NDIC is doing. We just, prior to this webinar, kicked off a working group that will focus on this very topic of the use of real-world evidence for emergency use authorizations and the kind of data needed to turn this into authorized diagnostics. I think also, people wonder how they can get involved. There is the way of communicating with FDA about your ideas, which is to submit a Q submission, and it's a very effective way to be concrete about what kind of study you have in mind, to get the FDA's feedback in a timely way. And when it comes down to, I think part of the issue is we often talk broadly, all of us on this line here, we talk broadly about what the data should look like in terms of quality, but people want to know, what about my study? What should I do? And that's where it gets very difficult, because the data need to be fit to the purpose. Once the purpose is understood, then you can say, is this the right set of common data elements? Do I have an appropriate fill rate for the really important data elements? And so I would just encourage interaction on the the one-on-one level with FDA, and it's a mutual learning process. There's a great deal of interest in seeing what ideas people have in mind, and we'd like to support that.
Wendy, can you give some examples of how the FDA has worked with companies previously to bring products to market using real-world data?
Yeah, there are some specific examples that are laid out in the new framework for using real-world data in regulatory submissions that the MDIC just put out. I think that the framework is also useful when it should be published soon. It's also useful for just thinking about different scenarios, and you should be able to read yourself into one or more of those scenarios.
Great. Wendy used the term fit for purpose. Tyler, can you talk a little bit about, from an IVD manufacturer's perspective, what types of considerations we might have in determining whether data is fit for purpose?
Like every good research question, you have to typically start with the end in mind. So where is it that you want to go, and how are you going to get there? By setting your question circled around the evidence gap, you can then consider what data are available to me in order to address that gap, and what methodology would I use in order to test my hypothesis. Fit for purpose data are those that have sufficient quality, relevance, reliability to address that hypothesis that's being posed. And they also have the necessary variables, missingness accounted for, confounders, outcomes measured in an appropriate way, and certainly the ability to identify the individual device in many instances that would address that hypothesis. And typically that's a pretty tall order to ask of real world data in non-COVID instances. I think what we're seeing though is a shift in thinking towards the value around real world data, and how we can be working together, industry, FDA, academia, in order to develop databases that are going to be more fit for purpose, not only for regulatory purposes, but also for answering key questions about clinical utility, and understanding unmet need in patient populations who otherwise wouldn't be addressed in clinical trials. And so, I think fit for purpose is very much a question-specific outcome that's dictated by the hypothesis and the research question. But really, it's a tall order to handle. And I think the well-designed study design with thoughtful considerations for data in conjunction with liaising with the FDA will improve the value of real-world data. in its utility and regulatory decision making.
So what I'd like to do is give everybody the opportunity to ask each other questions. I think we could have a nice conversation here. So do any of you have any questions that you would like to ask of anyone else on the panel?
I actually wanted to go back to a topic that was brought up at the very beginning with Bill around data access. And we know that there's lots of data out there, but as end users in industry, we can't access it. It's a real challenge for us to do data landscaping, to understand what is timely and relevant in the larger framework of data availability. So I'm wondering how we go to rapidly respond to things like pandemics, but also thinking about moving forward, how can we improve fair access to data for the use of regulatory decision making or for product development in a way that's mutually beneficial to providers, to patients, as well as those that are innovating to bring products to market.
Bill, can you respond to that?
Yes, I can now. It's an interesting question asked from this perspective, because from the device side, because I haven't thought of it in that way. I think that obviously having the ability at Mayo, we have invested so much in having an integrated, unified data, data pool or platform that we can ask all sorts of questions on in different directions. And we're one of the few that actually include UDI for lab tests in that database. So we can even go that direction. And I think what it really is going to take, it goes back to your point around the fit for purpose really depends on the question being asked. And I think what we need are all the different stakeholders that would want to query the data, to have the ability to have input in how that data is constructed, so that any one of us can ask the questions that we need to ask and then be able to go into the data to query it to find the answer to that. So from my side, of course, we can do a lot internally to look at our data, and now look even at different assays that have received EUA and how they perform compared to clinical outcomes or clinical decisions or repeat rates or those sorts of things. We can't help any of our partners with those same decisions that use Mayo Clinic labs, even though we've now done 600,000 COVID molecular tests on multiple different platforms. We have no way to help others answer that question because we can't reach across in a unified way to look at what we're seeing as observations in our own setting would be applicable to another healthcare system that's using our diagnostics. So I think to answer your question, I would say if we could get stakeholders around, and that's why I think the Reagan UDAL work is important in Diagnostic Evidence Accelerator, is you have multiple stakeholders, all that want to ask different questions that are meaningful out of the same data. So how do we just construct that data, allow access while protecting privacy, and to enable us to do that? And whether that's through asking the question through an intermediary, or just making sure that the data itself is constructed in a way that allows us to go into it and have de-identified elements. But because it really, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I would see the best path forward.
Great. And just as a quick follow-up to that, Bill, I understand that Mayo is one of the contributors to the NEST Coordinating Center. And that's fairly recent, as I understand it. Is that the type of intermediary that you're thinking about that might be able to query such data?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's why we're interested in participating in some of these, because at some point it can't be, we need a convener that is truly trusted by all the different stakeholders to be able to be the single source that we can go to. So that's why we are participating in the NEST project as well, program.
Terrific, terrific. Other questions that you have for each other?
Yeah, I would like to ask Wendy, just her perspective on, given, some of the changes really that we're now looking at, and we've been working on for the past 4 or 5, even 10 years, related to instrumentation, reporting of results, and et cetera. What do you see? Because I think I kind of know the answer with initiatives like SHIELD and the work the MDIC is doing. how do we get the word out, and so that, all the important players do understand, some of the things they need to do to really enable, real world data and real world evidence.
Mm-hmm. Well, we didn't ask for this pandemic. We would never ask for it, but it is having the effect of bringing people to the table and focusing energy. And I've heard other people say this. I actually think that because it's so urgent to understand diagnostics in COVID-19, it is really forcing us to come together to solve the problem. And if we solve this once, we can solve it for other diagnostic and clinical situations. So I guess that's a broad answer. In terms of getting the word out, we need initiatives like the NEST collaborating communities. We need initiatives like the Reagan-Udall Evidence Accelerator, because people are very interested. I think that, having worked in different health systems for most of my career, there tends to be a bit of an insular view to think, well, if we're a big enough health system, we can figure it out on our own. We're going to have our data all put together and have our own data warehouse. But in situations like this, and many others, particularly oncology, we need really truly big data. We can't have big data until we have semantic interoperability and quality.
Thank you, Wendy. You mentioned that we still need semantic interoperability, and I know, Ed, we're making tremendous progress. What other barriers do you see to the use of real-world data in a prolific way? Tyler, what about you?
Yeah, from my perspective, the two biggest barriers have really already been well described here. It's around data access, and it's around identifying the unique device. Without being able to do that, at least for a regulatory context, then I struggle to see how we can use real world data effectively and efficiently. The good thing is that we have partners and bodies like NEST that are willing to work with manufacturers. And maybe it's on us as manufacturers to now take the initiative to work with NEST and other federated data models and data aggregators. And at the same time, the FDA is slowly inching towards this concept of SHIELD and how we can use LOINC for UDI. And so I think that I would applaud their initiatives in that regard as well. So we're all slowly getting there. And I really do think if we reconvene a year from now, we'll be having a much different conversation around the maturity and the value of real world data, not only in response to coronavirus, but how we can use it in routine product development life cycles.
Terrific. I hope we are having another conversation a year from now, and it is much further advanced. Ed, how about you? What barrier do you still see?
Yeah, and I think as Tyler highlighted, there's still some ways to go, to kind of get this integrated and understood by everyone, so that you truly do have manufacturers and the industry itself promoting and understanding this is what needs to be done. This is the data that needs to be collected. These are potentially updates or changes maybe to instrumentation to get that kind of data. And to kind of build a little bit on what Wendy said, I think I can speak for many of the representatives of SHIELD. It has been rewarding over the last 2 or 3 months to be able to participate and really contribute to the efforts to understand the pandemic. The HHS has issued their guidance for laboratory reporting of COVID testing, and then one of those items is to use a livid base catalog that the industry has put together, that captures all of the EUA tests that have been approved. And in that document, it's got everything you need to take the test you've been running, understand the instrument you ran it on, and then identify the appropriate common vocabulary or terms that need to be included as you report that test. And there's no way any of us 5 or 6 years ago could have ever imagined this would be one of the things we don't really know today, but we'll want to be ready to support something. And truly, you know, something has happened that we feel that we've been able to be a significant contributor. And I think that's really a testament to all the participants and everyone who's you know, been involved with that. But once again, we're also learning. The UDI has really become an important topic around both the device and both the test. So, you know, we're able to take this situation, learn from it, and improve what we've got put in place as far as helping collect the right data. And then ultimately, as everyone discussed, in a year from now, we will have ideally have solved this one, so that as whatever comes next, we'll already be prepared for, you know, collecting and achieving some interoperability with hopefully nothing like this. But whatever future initiatives that arise and needs that have to be met.
You know, Ed, I was just talking to somebody about interoperability today, and I said it's like this giant elephant, but semantic interoperability is a very important bite of that elephant. So thanks for your work on that. Bill, what about you? What barriers do you still see?
Well, it's interesting because my perspective is, it goes back to Wendy's point about missing elements. And actually the data will only be as good, as complete as it is, as you look at, and I think the lab diagnostic world is, and even in COVID, I'll use serology as an example. We've had relatively slow uptake of serologic testing because there's still uncertainty about what decisions can be made in a care setting based on a result. Yet the best way to answer that is to generate the information now and then have longitudinal data to understand how protective seroconversion is for individuals and correlate that with molecular assays to know is that as well, really to generate the information to get at the extending the claims that Tyler spoke to. So I think a part of the strength of this collaboration could be in lab diagnostics for something as overwhelming as this, to actually also work with the payers or with, through collaboratives to actually fund some of the data creation that's going to be needed. So that's my biggest concern right now, is we're going to be hamstrung if we had been doing a lot of serologic testing now, once other cold viruses and respiratory viruses started coming on in the fall, we would be much better able to answer if people are really getting reinfected with COVID or not after they've seroconverted. And here, there's not that many people in parts of this country, the United States, who haven't seroconverted. So that to me, I know it doesn't really, it's a little different take on the barriers, but that's a big one for me right now.
Maybe I can add to that, because you're helping me to put on my hat, having worked with different healthcare systems, and the data missingness, sometimes it just comes because the LIS doesn't communicate with the EHR and, issues like that. And sometimes it's because data are not captured in a structured format. Some of these problems can actually be solved if the stakeholders at hand really have a belief, they understand the value proposition of making these things happen. Either sometimes on the practitioner level, although we don't want to put everything on the burden of, data entry, but often on the hospital system. And so what I heard you talk about before in terms of what kind of queries can we get out of the Mayo data? What do we want to ask of it? These are the perfect use cases that drive the common data element that we need to create. And they're also the use cases that engage the stakeholders in really wanting to do this, because they then can see the value back in getting the questions they want answered.
Wendy, you mentioned the common data element. What's the next step in getting that done? I mean, you mentioned these great use cases. I mean, this is starting to get really exciting talking about this. So, how do that?
I've seen iterations from the SHIELD initiative that look like at least the important elements that you and I, every time there's a conversation where, we just read a Twitter feed, we know what those elements are. We know we can jot them down. So they've been jotted down. and there are things that you would guess, which is, you know, what was the test, and there have to be identifiers. What was the result? There has to be a, you know, a date the test was ordered, the date it was resulted, all those sorts of things. You know, another step is to develop a data model and to get into some of the nitty gritty about, well, what are those fields and what type of fields are, and you know, what are the sorts of things you could put in them. That is something, I have to say, I think it's far less difficult to do than things like capturing the data, doing it in a way that provenance can be established, getting systems to be consistent, you know, addressing some of the endless customization that we see in electronic health records, getting rid of that mindset. That's harder than, you know, coming up with a list of what's the important data elements and what data model are we going to use.
Terrific. Would anybody else like to weigh in on this or have any further questions of each other? If not, what I'd like to do is have each person give one last message that you'd like to give to the people watching today. And what would you like to tell them about real-world data and COVID-19? Tyler.
I think that we have a real opportunity to not only ensure, of course, first and foremost, the safety and effectiveness of the EUA devices that are on the market right now, but we also have the ability to bring really effective change in clinical practice with the use of these solutions. And in doing so, not only are we having the opportunity to solve immediate healthcare needs, but we're also setting a precedent for future novel and innovative ways we can bring products to market that are continuing to ensure that patients are receiving safe vitro diagnostics and effective diagnostics, but also lowering the barrier of entry to products in the marketplace. So I think it's a considerable win-win for regulator, for patient provider, as well as for manufacturers. So I hope that all interest groups take a chance, and like I said before, we can talk about this in a year and have a use case, if not many, even though we're in the time of a difficult pandemic. There's a silver lining.
Thank you, Tyler. Ed.
Yeah, I think my message would be, you know, for those of you, you know, who are participating, and you know, I've always kind of wondered, well, okay, real world data, real world evidence, some of these initiatives that are out there, you know, maybe you've kind of been sitting on the fence as to, you know, what do I need to do, or what should, you know, what can I contribute, or what changes might I need to make in my instrument, device, et cetera. I think, you know, the COVID and the pandemic has really shown, you know, the true benefits and what all of us have been trying to achieve for several years now. And I hope they kind of take this. There's lots of resources out there that are now being made available. If you're uncertain about something, there's lots of organizations to reach out to, whether it's CDC, even, you know, the FDA and manufacturers. And please take this opportunity to learn more about it if you don't know enough about it. You know, leverage the resources and really, you know, take, you know, I think as Wendy highlighted, we really need to take advantage of what's occurred so that we're prepared for the next one.
Absolutely. Bill.
I guess my takeaway message would be that to do this well, we really need all the different stakeholders and potential end users at the table putting in their use cases for what they would do with the data, so that we can construct the data in a way that it adds value to everyone, as opposed to just some one specific use case. And so I think that's on the one side, it's of course medical practice and decision makers, clinical decision making. It's the manufacturers of the diagnostics itself, so they can understand performance and performance characteristics, and also claims for use. And then even societally, I think the other piece of this is if we put more completeness and understand that COVID-19 has highlighted disparities in healthcare which need to be addressed. If we could start to think about how we would incorporate some data that would allow us to identify those opportunities for improvement of healthcare systems globally, I think that would be important. My hope is that this wave of COVID will leave behind it some of the architectural elements that will be need to ask this question over and over again for other diseases. And so but that all takes a lot of stakeholder engagement at this point in time, because the choices we make now will make those possible or not.
Excellent, thank you. Wendy, one last takeaway?
Thank you. Well, I can see that, Tyler and Ed and Bill have answered this question beautifully. The pandemic is providing all of the activation energy we need. Things are happening. Get engaged. There are many ways to do it. Just jump in.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to all of you, all of the great panelists today for this discussion. And to those of you listening, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for attending MDIC's Annual Public Forum. We hope you will join us for next week's session for a conversation about patient preference and real-world evidence strategies to develop a patient-centered regulatory strategy with Stephanie Christopher, Senior Program Manager, Health Insights at Providence St. Joseph Health, and Carrie Keene, Senior Manager, Regulatory and Clinical at Evidation Health. Visit apf.mdic.org for more information and to catch up on previous sessions.